want to invite you to find a spot down front, and we're getting ready to start here in just a second. Go ahead and move down front.
Singing today.
All right. Well, we're thankful that you all are here, that you stuck around for our conversation as we kind of jump back in to this conversation, this topic around topic of grief, of anxiety. Grief was last week. Sorry. I want to remind you that we are providing an opportunity for you to ask questions and to participate in the conversation. And you can text in those questions to 469, it's up on the screen there, 469-770-3007. And that has been a really meaningful part of this series as we've received a lot of your questions. And so feel free to ask things that you might be thinking about as they relate to this topic, or something that was mentioned in the sermon, or a question that you've always wondered about but you've never heard anybody address. We want to invite you to be a part of that. Also, I want to just mention, I've not done this, failed to do this in some weeks, but I want to be sure and mention this table that we've put in the back, in the foyer in the back. During this series, we've purchased some resources, some resource books on all the topics we're discussing, and so and have kind of replenished that table each week as the books have been taken. And so I encourage you to look at the table, see if there's a topic or a book that seems of interest to you or personally relevant to you and to your life and your situation. And if you've read a book already and you want to bring it back, you can do that, and maybe someone else can take it. So we've purchased a number of copies, or give it to somebody else. We just want those to be helpful. So just be aware that table's back there. So I'm not going to spend as much time introducing the three of these people because they've all already been on a previous panel, Adam, Aaron, and Heather. But I'm thankful that y'all are back. If you want all the information about them, you can look on our Facebook page or our Facebook page or our Instagram page, because we have all their information there. But we're going to just jump into our conversation. Does that sound good? So remember, you can text in questions. I have not received one that I know of yet. So we have plenty to talk about, but we would love to hear from you as well. So I want to start with getting one of you to help us kind of think about defining anxiety a little bit. I attempted to do a little bit of that in the sermon, but maybe we can kind of flesh that out a little bit more. So can you guys talk for a minute about what we're talking about when we talk about anxiety, and maybe even going into a little detail about the difference between being anxious for a single experience or situation, opposed to having some type of anxiety that might be more debilitating. And so, one of you want to jump in and start that?
I can.
Great.
So I think that I had my earbud listening a little bit during children's class, so I'm sorry for your first through third graders. They were fine. They're all alive. They're good, I think. So I think you did a great job at kind of defining that between being anxious and having anxiety. So being anxious are things where maybe a single event or situation where first day at a new job, a job interview, big test in school, things like that, where you have that feeling welling up inside of you, and it often pushes you towards something, right? So if I'm preparing to go for a job interview, I'm going to think about the things that I'm going to say. I'm going to prepare my responses. If I'm going for a test, I'm going to study. Like it can oftentimes prepare you in a positive way, sometimes in a negative way, but then also that anxious feeling once that event is done, I think there's a sense of relief, like you're able to move through. Where anxiety, it's that prolonged and intense response to that emotion, fear, stress, anxiety, or fear, stress, anger, that there is no relief from. That even after a certain event passes or you're preparing it, it is prolonged and it's debilitating. So, like you mentioned, you aren't able to go to work, you aren't able to go to school, you aren't able to engage in relationships. Maybe you're sleeping too much, maybe you're not sleeping enough, not eating too much. So it can look a lot of different ways.
That's good. One of y'all want to add anything to that?
I might just add that sometimes I like to think of anxiety as a survival tool, which you talked about that a little bit, but oftentimes it has a message to us about some way of keeping us safe, whether that's physically or emotionally or relationally. It has a kind of survival message there.
That's good. Anything to add? You good? Okay. All right. So a follow-up question to that, and maybe this is just getting you to elaborate on that, at least to start a little bit more, Aaron, is that in the sermon I talked about some of the necessary ways that anxiety can function in our lives. And so I'm wondering if maybe you'd start with thinking about, like, can you kind of talk more or explain more about some of the natural ways that our nervous systems respond when they're triggered and how some of that is okay? So really it's just kind of getting you to elaborate maybe on what you just started talking about.
Yeah, I mean, some of what Heather was talking about probably fits
Related.
there. If I'm anxious about a test, then it makes sense that I would be, because I want to do well on it, and so I'll work extra hard and study, so it's serving a purpose there to keep me going. Maybe another natural way that it comes in, I would think about if we go back to even our childhood, right? If you have a parent who maybe has a pretty big temper, your anxiety can start to well up and serves a really good purpose. If I'm more hypervigilant and make the right moves, well then maybe my parent won't get mad or whatnot. And so it's sending a message to you of how to survive, how to get through that really tough thing. And then when it becomes problematic is then when it becomes this like chronic feeling of hypervigilance and anxiety, where now more things look like and feel like a threat than really are.
Almost disproportionate
Yes.
to what's happening in the moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So does that answer
Yeah,
that
that's
question?
good.
Okay.
That's good. One of the questions that I want to ask here that has already come in that I think might, just because we're kind of trying to define terms and talk about it, and Austin mentioned in his testimony this idea of a panic attack, and so that one of the questions that was asked was, is a panic attack part of anxiety, or does a panic attack cause anxiety? And just kind of, I think, wanting maybe you guys to kind of talk about that as a response, like what's happening in our bodies when people experience those. Maybe somebody might not know how do I know when I am experiencing that, so what do y'all want to tackle that? Start with that.
Sure. It's interesting with panic attacks too, because I think people think they might be in the middle of a very anxious, like anxiety-provoking situation, and then that's when the anxiety attack occurs. And what I've, and friends and family and clients have heard is that panic attacks often happen out of the blue. You may not even be in the middle of an anxiety-producing event, and all of a sudden there's a lot of times associated like chest tightness, rapid breathing, difficulty breathing, sweating, just this inability, like this stuckness is the best word. I think that people have described it. and you don't know necessarily the source of it. You know, I've been with family members in the middle of a church service and a happy thing, a Christmas Eve event, and they have to leave because it feels like a heart attack. And so, I mean, you're seconds away from calling 911. Or we have several people that come into the emergency room every single day in relation to anxiety and panic attacks. I mean, and that mimic very much a heart attack or a severe medical condition. So it can pop up on you out of the blue, not necessarily in the middle of anxiety. But again, it typically includes a lot of those things, those physical attributes of mimicking the heart attack or rapid breathing, those things.
That's helpful. You want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we all have what is called like a window of tolerance for how much stress we're able to take in. And on one side of that window is shut down, and on the other end of that is being flooded. And so I think when we have panic, it's when we're really moving towards feeling completely flooded by the emotion in our body and what's going on. So, and we're going to talk about, you know, different ways of dealing with anxiety. And another way of looking at that is those are also ways I can widen my window of tolerance for how much I can take in before I move into this like flooded state.
That's good. So along that line, Adam, I'm going to get you to start with this question, but I know one of the questions that I have talked with people about that I'm also, I think is maybe helpful for us thinking about this is, you know, are we more anxious people today than we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or do we just know more about it? Because sometimes you'll hear people say, well, no, we just know more about these things now. We're not, it's always been this way or whatever. So that's kind of the first question, but then really as a part of that, you know, if we are more anxious, what are some of the contributing factors to that reality that we, you know, that there are every day people go into the hospital because they're experiencing these things. And so I want to get you to start, and then I'll get Aaron and Heather can follow up to that.
This is a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. My guess is I think we are more anxious. If I'm guessing, I think that's the case. I would say. So, for example, I think even with COVID, like even the past couple of years, how I'm talking about it is like these different altitude levels of impact, right? I mean, we've all had particular losses in our lives, right? In the past couple of years, we've had particular stressors that are like granular, you know, like located, contextualized things. But then you zoom out, and the collection of like global and cultural things, and it feels like it's the air we're breathing, right? Of a global pandemic, or the racial injustice stuff that we've been navigating lately. It's just been at the forefront, or how politically polarized we are in our country, and the cultural upheaval. It's like, I feel like there's this convergence of global cultural things way up here, 30,000 feet high, but then it's down into there's this person losing their job, or my child just came out. And what do I do with that? You know, and your world. So it's like, I feel like it's on every altitude level. And I would suggest this, and we don't have time to get into this,
Sure,
but I've read some stuff about like every 500 years, like the world significantly changes. And there's research, but like the Enlightenment happened 500 years ago, right? And the world changed, right? The modern era started, but it wasn't that way. And we're hitting about a 500-year. And I think the world is changing right now faster than it ever has, I think. And we're kind of trying to get our sense of what's this world that we're moving into. So I think there's, and then the third thing I would say, and then I'll shut up. But I think that I think that mental wellness is no longer a taboo.
Right.
I think we're talking about it, which is good. and it's almost like now that we're getting new language, I mean, self-care is all of a sudden, it's a good topic, right? We didn't talk about self-care. That wasn't a phrase a year ago, right? But now we're talking about so I think it's more in the forefront, which is, I think, a good thing. But I think it's because it's the times we're in.
Yeah.
So,
You want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think we're more aware of the threats now than we were before because of social media, because of the news, things like that. You know, our brains are constantly scanning for threat, and it's right in front of our face so much more. As I was thinking about that, I thought, what would be a good example of that? And I thought of like a postpartum mom. You know, there's so many things we know now about, you know, SIDS, things like that, where, you know, 50 years ago, we weren't thinking about how are we going to lay our baby down in the crib. You know, we're more aware of the threats. And so with that means that we're going to be more anxious about what could happen or what could go wrong.
Yeah, so it's almost like one thing creates another challenge, but it's not like nobody set out to do that, but
Right.
the knowledge does create the
Yeah,
awareness.
and you can't unknow what you know.
Right,
And
right,
we
right.
don't want to unknow it, but we do have to grow in our capacity to soothe and comfort that anxiety.
Yeah, that's good.
I think back to you about, you know, the class we did a couple of months ago about being busy. And I think especially in like my season of life, if you're a parent of little people, it's almost, if you're not anxious about something, then you're not doing something right. And so I think because we're constantly so busy, and I think the social media component of this expectation of what we should be doing compared to the others around us, and the busyness that our lives include, that leads to some anxiety, and kind of consistently it becomes part of the norm. So.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so thank you guys for sending the questions in that you're sending in. I want to try to touch on one more that we've prepared, and then we can see what we're doing, how we're doing on time. How do we know if the anxiety that we are experiencing or someone else in our lives is experiencing is on that spectrum? That I like how you talked about that, Aaron, of like what were the two window of tolerance? But what are the two ends of it, of the top one?
Shut down and flooded.
Yeah, shut down and flooded. Right. So how do we know if the anxiety we're experiencing or someone else in our lives is experiencing is more serious? What are some things that we should look for as a part of that? So, Heather or Aaron, want to start? Want to start that?
Okay. I think
we didn't script who's going to go first. If y'all can't tell,
I'll say a few things,
we're
then
trying to
you
make
say
this
a few
like natural and relaxed. So it's like,
yeah, we're not anxious at all.
yeah, the irony. The irony that things like
Yeah. So I think, yes, if we're in a maybe I shouldn't say constant, but if we find ourselves feeling flooded, you know, the emotion is just coming in faster than we can deal with it, then that's, you know, we should be concerned. If we find ourselves, you know, feeling shut down a lot and numb and not feeling anything, that might be an indication that there was a lot happening there, and in order to deal with it, we had to shut it off. Another big thing is if you notice someone or yourself kind of isolating, avoiding any type of trigger and wanting to be alone, not wanting to get out, that would be something to be, you know, pay attention to. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be some physical signs. Most often you're going to see somebody, maybe you've seen some excessive weight loss, excessive weight gain, frequent tardiness or absenteeism from work, school, things, relationships, social events. Somebody maybe who is particularly involved, usually kind of checking out. And I think you can, you know, we talked about that quiet presence before. I think you oftentimes can be around somebody and sense some anxiety, sense some of that rapid breath, those types of things. Just the physical attributes I think you can pinpoint to.
that's good.
Something I forgot was just maybe finding yourself sitting in the most catastrophic thought of a situation that could be there and not being able to get out of that thought.
My wife's a therapist as well, and So it's weird for her to be the mom to our young adult children who are both in college. And so she's like wearing both hats. And kind of to your point, I think like we noticed in our daughter, like when she would skip a day of class and she just saw Netflix all day, well, we're like, that's a big indicator, right? If normal functioning is affected, and versus, okay, it's test week. There's a lot, right? Those are different. That's kind of what we were like, maybe you might need to get back into therapy. So my wife, the therapist, and mom is saying, you need to go to therapy, for our children. But we were noticing that, right? Because the everyday functioning was really
But what was
affected.
she watching on Netflix?
Well, we don't need to go into that.
Okay, really good questions that have come in. So let's touch on some of these, and we can get back to maybe with our time. Keep track of our time, and see if we may be able to get back to some of what we've talked about covering. So one question that came in is there a genetic component to anxiety? Debatable? You want to just say what you know, I guess, about it, and then we can...
Well, I'm not a doctor.
We didn't
I'm not a
plan these questions
geneticist
either, so
but
this is all off
it
the
is a
top.
little debatable. I think there are generational patterns that we can't deny, although I'm not a geneticist, so I'm not going to say if I think that has to do with nature or nurture, maybe a little bit of both. We do find that like kind of emotional sensitivities tend to, like I'm a highly sensitive person, so it's not shocking that so are my kids, things like that. So I probably, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't think we should pin it all on that, though.
Okay.
Okay, maybe that's what I should say about that, yeah.
I mean, I think when I think about conversations I've had with some adoptive families when maybe they've adopted an infant and thinking that, we'll have this child from infancy, so there's going to be no part of maybe biological families. And as kiddos get into elementary and middle or high school, a young adult, and they see some of the same mental health struggles that the biological parents struggled with, I mean, I think that's an undeniable glimpse into a piece of that. I mean, it's just a natural tendency for some of those things to show up, so.
Yeah. I was just going to say, if you have, it makes sense if you think about it more so from so let's say you have parents that were highly stressed and highly anxious. In order for you to cope with that, maybe you also were highly anxious and stressed in order to kind of work around what they were dealing with. So that's what I mean by kind of generational patterns that we would see. But as far as, is it genetic? Is it something in their genes? That I don't know if I feel qualified to answer that. Yeah.
It almost makes me bring up a similar question of are certain personalities more prone, right? I mean, we're wired differently, and that's praise God, and there's a gift there. But are there some personalities that need to be attentive to? Because it's almost like all of us have an unhealthy version of our personality and a healthier version of our personality. One isn't more healthier than the other, but it's like, what can be a redeemed, healthy version of myself versus the kind of shadow version and I wonder if there's some personality. I'm just kind of spitballing here, but
That's good. Go
Maybe
ahead.
think of, during my clinical supervision for a couple of years, one of my supervisor's big things was looking at the Enneagram. I don't know if any of y'all know what number you are or have ever looked into that. I'm a 2. So there you go. But there's some really helpful information. There's a book, The Enneagram Made Simple, and it talks about the healthy traits and the unhealthy traits. Like when you're in the midst of crisis and anxiety, where do you tend to go to? And that can be either a healthy side and a not so healthy. There's great things about being a 2, which is a people person, and some not so great things about being a people person in the midst of anxiety and crisis. So it's a good kind of resource, I think, that's helped me understand myself. And if you read through it, you're like, oh yeah, those are the things about me. When you find your number, you find your number. So.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, how do I help my child who is experiencing anxiety without letting my own escalate while I help them work through it?
Good luck.
That's like the impossible question. Oh, that's the impossible question.
Just received the impossible question.
Man. So, I was by the way, it's so good to see the Fears family, because David Fears was my first youth elder when I was first starting out in ministry. So it's good to see them. They just so shaped my life early on. So, after about 15 years of youth ministry, I transitioned to family ministry. And in that intersection, this was my passion, was this question. When the spirituality of the parents connects to how we parent, right? It's like I felt more motivated to pray when my kids started to become teenagers. and it wasn't just asking for God to bless them. It was being with God and coming to terms with my stuff interiorly, right? I think if we as parents are not dealing with our interior issues, and then you're trying to be a non-anxious presence with your child, it's almost like you're not setting yourself up. I feel like parents need to practice being still with God in order to be more centered. And you can't just say it. You can't just say it, but I think we are to be a non-anxious presence is the cheapest platitude to say this morning, and I think it's exactly what's required. And believe me, I mean, our kids were pretty healthy children, and COVID messed them up. COVID messed up. I mean, they were pretty good. Dad's a minister, mom's a therapist. We were pretty good, and both of our kids had to go to therapy in COVID. And by the way, none of their high school teachers were doing well either.
Yeah.
Right? So teachers were not at their best, and their unintended pain that they're inflicting on our children, and now pain is just pinballing on pain. And we're just watching it. I'm just watching teachers hurt our children, right? Who were trying their best.
Right.
And we're just having to practice being a non-anxious presence. It's just hard. There's no magic pill for it. But I think parents have got to be called to maybe some of these, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, but some of these contemplative practices. We don't need to study anymore. This is not a Bible study thing. We need to get to the spiritual practices that bypass the thinking mind and get into the soul, because our souls have got to be non-anxious right now. So.
That's good.
Yeah, I think contemplative practices train us to be aware of our body and aware of what's happening in our body, and slows us down enough to start paying attention to that. And so how to not be anxious when my child is anxious, I think that might be asking too much of ourselves. So instead, maybe be more aware of when I am getting anxious while they're anxious, and me recognizing this is me, this is my anxiety, and I need to slow myself down. I need to take a deep breath. I might need to step away for a minute before I come back to the conversation, because what I bring to this interaction, I add to it. So do I want to add my anxiety on top of theirs? No. So I need to be aware of when it's happening for me so that I can take care of myself in order to take care of them.
That's good.
Well, I think too, it made me think of like last week when we were at small group and we all got to sit around and talk about our kids and the things that were especially challenging and that were out of our control, to have an opportunity outside of those kiddos to have a community of people where you get to express those things, because it's first there are things that provide anxiety for you, and to recognize them and have a safe space, if it's friends, or even if it's a spouse or somebody in your home with you that can recognize, because sometimes you can't regulate that yourself. And sometimes if your person in the home needs to step in and be like, hey, like you need a break. And to be able to receive that, sometimes it's hard to receive that. But to have that safe space where you can tag in, tag out, and outside of those moments, have real conversation about what that looks like and how hard it is and how great it can be, and just the honesty in that piece
Yeah, I
as
think
well.
too, like one of the things that stood out to me from Austin's testimony was that he said that God provided people. Yes. You know, and I know lots of us have experienced, like I would agree with his statement, and I would say my own life, one of the ways that God has been most present for me is through other people. You know, maybe I haven't experienced God as much when I'm sitting in silence or in solitude, or I'm, you know, going away to be out in nature or creation. But I have experienced him by sharing lunch with Adam, you know, and sitting around in a living room with people who care about me and who you can share. So I think it's a little thing like that we think, oh yeah, I'm doing that, but like don't like that. I'd say like not minimize that either. So we have received such good questions and so many questions, and we have 15 minutes left that I am going to try. So give your very best answer in the shortest version you can give it. And some of the questions, anxiety and depression, are kind of related a little bit. We're talking about depression next week. A couple of you have sent in some questions about some of those things. So I'm going to save those for the end, and we'll see how much time we have, because if we don't talk about them today, we can also get to those next week. But one of the questions is, I associate anxiety with worry. Where do we draw the line between worry and anxiety and responsible concern about real-life struggles?
This will be short. I'll try.
Anxiety.
I know. Feels anxious to be short. I think.
Also, do the question justice.
Sure, no.
I'm not as concerned about it.
The thing that quickly comes to mind is the practice of being present. I think a lot of our headspace is either guilt and shame about the past or anxiety about the future. But practicing being present, and our phones we're not being present. But I think when we practice being present in this moment.
What would that look like? Could you tease that out a little bit?
Well, so I think some of the contemplative practices teach us this.
And we've used that word. We all know what that means.
Okay, but to practice,
so
to be silent with God, and that could even be 5 minutes, 15, 30 minutes, maybe an hour, but practicing being still in this moment and knowing that God is with us as we breathe, and we don't have to say anything, and we're just with the one that loves us in this moment, right? It's a practice to be silent with God. Or how do we eliminate distractions to where we're present as we cook this meal, right? We're not talking about, we're going to cook this meal, and we're not going to do anything else right now. We're not going to talk about anything. We're going to be with each other in this moment. I think there's practices of being present. It was really hard. I've done this, by the way, even at church, or when you're talking to someone and you see someone else and you say hi, or you're not present with that person. It's all. I was a minister for 25 years. To not notice that Doug is right over here waiting to talk to me, but to be present with whoever's talking to me. I just think there's a practice of being present. Yeah. Because worry is when we're preoccupied about the future and we can't control that, right? So.
That's good.
And that was long. That wasn't short. Dang it. Sorry.
You failed. I'm just kidding. Good job. Okay. You want to add anything, or me keep going?
I was just going to add
Please do.
presence. The phrase that I like to use for that is being present is bringing my brain where my body is. So I've got all of me right here, and my brain's not, trailing off to a million other things.
Yeah, and our body can't be in tomorrow or in whatever thing we're worried about. So that, to connect that to the worry piece of the question, that's good. Thank you. And it takes work, like, that's also like a thing that takes a conscious effort to do.
It's a
it, right?
practice.
Right.
Yeah.
When I'll talk with clients and friends and stuff like about identifying too what's with you in the moment, like thinking about the softness of this chair, the things that you hear. I can hear the traffic. I can maybe, like, if you're at home, I can smell the lunch. Like, identifying the things that are in the moment, like grounding yourself. I think that's the way we describe is to ground yourself. What is going on right here and right now? What do I know is happening? Where do I feel safe? And either saying out loud those things or identifying what can I hear, taste, touch, feel, all of those things in that moment to bring you back to where you are.
That's good. Okay, so a lot of our teens are sitting here, maybe not all of them, but so one of the questions that came in was, after hearing the statistic from the sermon that 1 in 3 teen girls, 1 in 3 teen boys experiences anxiety, can y'all speak directly to teenagers, young adults, about navigating / managing anxiety in the stage of life that they are in?
I mean, I think maybe I would just validate that I think they have a lot of reasons to be anxious. There's a lot of pressure on teens. They spend a lot of hours in school. They spend a lot of hours outside of school doing activities where things are expected of them. They don't get enough sleep. And I mean that like there's not enough opportunity for them to get enough sleep. We know that they need really just as much sleep as like our babies did when we get in the teen years. So it makes sense that they are anxious. So I would encourage a teen to, number one, have somebody to talk to about what they're anxious about, because it's much harder to feel anxious alone than with someone else. And I would encourage them to talk with their parents about that, or a caregiver, but friends are really important too. So maybe that would just be the biggest thing. Have somebody you can talk to so they can keep an eye on you and know how bad it's getting if it gets too bad.
Yeah, that's good. This question is, I feel like talking about anxiety is something that makes me anxious. I often just avoid thinking about the possibility of the topic. How should I handle this?
I feel like I have too much to say today. Yes, sometimes we get anxious about not being anxious enough. You know, like, oh, I feel like I have something I should be anxious about right now. Now I'm anxious about that, which just adds another layer to what's actually happening in our body. So I don't want to talk about it yet. The way out is always through, and so you're going to have to.
Yeah.
What I think we talked about, we've talked about going to counseling and therapy, even talked last week, is sometimes you need to find the right fit, if it's a therapist or a trusted friend, a place where you feel safe, so you can talk about being anxious about being anxious, and that's okay, where there's not a judgment about that feeling, that is an acceptable feeling, but it's a spot where you feel safe to express that.
Yeah. Almost all of these topics, I mean, it's a big deal that y'all are coming to this series, by the way, because these are not easy, right? And it's almost like in your marriage, right? When you know there's a hard conversation coming, or it's like, it's not easy, right? So I feel like to bring something into the light that we usually don't talk about, it could be anxiety producing, right? And that's okay. Mm-hmm. That's okay. But to normalize it, to continue to cultivate hard conversations like this church does, is really good. It's really good.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so this one's come through a couple of times, so hopefully we'll be able to hear. I'm trying to acknowledge a couple of you who have asked this in different ways. But the question is, one way it came through was quoting Philippians 4:6, do not, and they're like questioning, do not be anxious. And then another way the question came through was based on Philippians 4:6, is anxiety a sin? Or maybe, is unaddressed anxiety a sin? which this person says was one of my dad's assertions. I'm thinking that they're meaning like a dad who's older and maybe even passed away maybe at this point, but maybe they grew up hearing that. And then another person asks, is being anxious considered a sin? So
I will quickly answer that and say no. Say no. The Psalms say that God knows how we're made. God knows how we're made. That the most cited commandment in the Bible is don't be afraid. That's the most cited command. And the Father's telling his children. Father's telling his children, don't be afraid. How could he think we're sinning against him by being afraid? God knows that we're going to be afraid. I just think that the compassionate heart of God. I was with my daughter yesterday. Drove down to Waco and back yesterday.
she's a student at Baylor.
She's a student at Baylor. And she was stressed. And she said, Dad, she's like, Dad, can you come see me today? I said, I'll get in the car. And I went and saw her yesterday. And I'm not saying, why are you afraid? Yeah. I'm not shaming her.
That's good.
No, God knows his children. It's okay. You're saying, hey, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid.
That's good.
Yeah, I think as thinking about if that's the message that you got from a parent, kind of having some compassion for them too, because I know when I run out of tools for my kids, my next phrase is stop it. Don't do the stop. That means I've run out of, I don't know what to say next. I don't have another intervention to use. All my tricks aren't working. But I think especially previous generations, there were not enough tools for how to help kids emotionally. And so when kids got anxious, stop being anxious. It's like, I don't have another tool other than to tell you to, or maybe it made the parent very anxious. And so if you will stop, then I will feel better, and not from a malicious place, but didn't know any different. And so, but I would encourage someone who, if that was the message they got, that it is bad for me to feel this way, it's sinful for me to feel this way, is to kind of call that out, that was a parent who didn't have any other tools than to try to tell me to shame me and to stop being anxious because they cared about me and didn't want me to feel anxious. But knowing that that's not really serving me anymore, to talk to myself that way. And so instead I would kind of flip that script, and it's okay for me to feel anxious, and there's compassion when I feel anxious, and it's not sinful that God made me to be able to be anxious.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so we're going to try to get to the rest of these really quickly. How do you navigate your anxiety when your family doesn't necessarily understand what you're feeling or how to help you through it?
I think there's almost a grace in the question, right?
That's good. Yeah.
There's a grace in that question in, when people mean well. I feel like if I'm grieving, if I've lost someone, the community, it's almost built in. I'm going to hear things that are very well intentioned, but they're not helpful, right? They're very well intentioned, but they're not helpful. And it's like, people that are grieving are so gracious to the community that's trying to love them, but not all of it's great, right?
Right.
And so as I almost hear that, I know my family's trying, but they're not helping me, right? Which is really cool.
Yeah. So
kudos to whoever asked that question. And I would say find what you need. Almost like Aaron's, who is a safe, trusted adult. And by the way, I would say listen 4 times more than you speak. This is like ministry of presence kind of stuff, right? To where it's not what we say that fixes any of this, but just being present with someone in the silence and listening to them. That's over half of it, I think. And I think, so if you're anxious, who is that person that will not say a word? That will not say a word and let you say it, that is safe and knows how to just have a ministry of presence. That's what we need. So I think find it. If it's not your family, then that's okay. There's a grace there, but find it.
I think it's okay to set some healthy boundaries too, even if that's with your family, to know that there's some places and situations that it's not as safe, even if it's the folks you live with in the moment, whatever it is, but to be able to set some boundaries for yourself. And if you're sharing how you feel about something, recognizing one is you can't control how somebody else responds to you in that moment, which can cause anxiety, but to be okay with that. I encourage people, I feel, not you made me, you did this to me, but I feel a certain way. And that is an acceptable thing. You can't control their response to that. And to learn how to set some boundaries, and that can be hard because it may be people that you really care about, but in the midst of managing and dealing with anxiety, it may not be a helpful experience, and that's an acceptable thing too.
Okay, a couple more. What advice would you give to those individuals who feel flat or are flat and don't react with a fight or flight response because of their past trauma? Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, there's fight, flight, and freeze.
Yeah.
And so I think what I'm hearing is that in that question is, what do I advise to someone who freezes?
Maybe, or maybe I maybe read it like maybe they don't feel like that they respond at all, but maybe that's freezing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's shutting down. That's going numb, which, especially with past trauma, is very much a survival mechanism. And if we think about how people have gotten through some really unthinkable things, their bodies and brains' ability to shut down and float away from where they are is probably what helped them survive. So we don't want to criticize them for that, but at the same time, we don't want to live in a constant state of being out of our body based upon that trauma or that experience. So I think my advice to someone who is struggling with that is, number one, do the really hard healing work of working through the trauma, or else it's not going to get better until you do that. And then in the midst of doing that trauma work, you will probably be invited into opportunities to start bringing your brain back to where your body is in the midst of anxiety-provoking situations.
You want to add anything, Heather?
Yeah, trauma changes the way your brain functions. And so it's evident, if you broke a bone, you're going to have to get the bone fixed. And so it's just like that. Your brain should have that ability to get that help that it needs.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so, man, great questions, you guys. Thank you all so much for what you shared. There's been a couple of other questions that I haven't mentioned, but we're gonna spend a couple of minutes trying to think about this. How is the best way to handle anxiety or the stress that you feel that's created by anxiety for things you don't have control over? Things like outside of your immediate, the way it's written is things more global outside of your immediate world. And so I want us to kind of talk about that one. Some of the other ones that we've already talked about, just about the idea of dealing with or processing this, worry. Another one that we didn't talk about but that came through, when anxiety is related to your disappointments with God, unanswered prayers, injustices that God seems to allow. It's hard to find solace in the nearness of God, which I talked about in the sermon. Is the solution more about dealing with doubt, unrealistic expectations of God than anxiety? You want to say anything about that before we?
Well, both those questions made me think about there may be a lament piece here, which is okay. If you're thinking about global things and things out beyond your control or in the world, and lament is, we're given permission to lament to God. So I think we may have said that a couple weeks ago even. So I'll think about that. I would say I think there's a curating of our media that may be helpful. I mean, if you're on the news channel all day, every day, that knows how to manipulate our fear, you know, that fear sells. And news channels have to pay the bills by stoking the fear. So I think you even said it in the sermon that we were not wired to carry the weight of the world, right? And to know all the different global catastrophes all at one time. We're kind of in our village, right? That's about our sphere, is about our village.
Yep.
And God is holding the world. So I think to pray and shrug your shoulders and, and just really, and there's a trusting of God that we practice. But I think we need to limit our exposure to what we really can't control anyways. Be aware, be global citizens, but if it's tapping into your anxiety, then there might need to be some practicing of how you consume media.
That's good. Okay, so I want to end with this. One of the things that the four of us have talked about in preparation for today is that there are a lot of different ways that response can happen to anxiety, and sometimes that's a trusted friend, sometimes that's a family member, sometimes that's a therapist. Sometimes we also want to, you heard it in Austin's testimony, but sometimes medication is needed, and we've talked a lot about, I wrote down in our conversation, a couple of ways that Heather and Aaron mentioned. I'm just going to mention this, and if y'all want to talk to them about it after you can, but Heather mentioned that reducing, it's important to reduce the stigma around that idea of taking medication when necessary. Aaron mentioned validating and normalizing that there are cases where medication is needed to calm the inner chaos enough to establish outward routines that can help with anxiety that we're dealing with. So I want to talk, we've talked about all of those, and then we've also mentioned this idea of contemplative practices, sitting with the Lord. And so what I have asked, some of you may remember, a couple of months ago, Aaron and I taught a class over in this classroom over here where we actually talked about some spiritual practices. Obviously, not everybody was in there, but one of the things that we've talked about as we have prepared for today is that maybe there would be some value in us ending our time engaging in doing a spiritual practice together. And so I've asked Adam to kind of lead us through that. I think Chris is going to throw Psalm 46 up here on the screens. And so this is going to be how we're going to end today. And then they'll be around if you want to visit with them further, but really appreciate all of your participation. So I'll turn it over to you for just a second.
Okay. So what I'd like to do, and I may not have the right translation that's mirrored up on the screen,
That's
so
true, yeah.
I apologize if that's okay. But I want to read Psalm 46. I want us to pray. We're not reading, we're going to pray Psalm 46. And this psalm, to me, is very appropriate because this seems like a psalm that seems like the world is on fire. And this is where the phrase that's very common to us, be still and know that I am God, comes in. So after this reading, I just want to take a couple minutes to be in the silence with God. If you want to close your eyes, just be aware of your breath and know that God is with us. God is closer to you than the air is to your skin. And we don't have to do anything or prove anything or say anything. We are just simply being with the one who loves us. So I'll pray this, and then we'll just be a couple minutes in the silence, and then I will break the silence with that phrase again, be still and know that I am God. And then that'll close our time. Let's pray. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake at the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city. It shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations are in an uproar. The kingdoms totter. He utters his voice. The earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord. See what desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow, he shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Be still and know that I am God. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Amen.
Amen. Thank you guys so much for your participation today. We're done. And if you have kids in Bible class, be sure to thank our Bible class teachers. They might have already released the kids. They might all be out there in the foyer waiting on us. Hey, thanks so much for joining us for online worship this morning. We're so glad that you've been with us today, and we hope that your time gathering with us in this way has been an encouragement to you and to your faith. If there's anything we can do, we would love to hear from you. We'd love to know about that. You can share prayer requests by simply texting the number that's there on the screen, and we'll receive those and be able to pray over those things this coming week. If you'd like to talk to someone, one of our ministers or one of our shepherding couples, please email us at questions@kaufmanchurch.org, and we'd love to connect with you. We'll be happy to reach out to you that way. There are a lot of things that are going on in the life of our church. If you're in our area, we'd love for you to be a part of any or all of those that you're able to be a part of. We want to thank you again for joining us today and choosing to be here and gather with us in this way. We hope you'll join us again next Sunday. I hope you have a good day, and I pray that you have a blessed week as you head into this new week. God bless.